Thanks for downloading Development Drums, episode number 45. My name is Owen Barder from the Centre for Global Development, and today we're looking at whether and how development economics can do a better job of understanding human behaviour, and what we can learn from the small but growing field of behavioural economics. I have the perfect person with me to discuss these issues. Varun Gauri is World Bank Senior Economist and was co-director of the 2015 World Development Report, which was called Mind, Society and Behaviour. Dr. Gauri has a long list of publications in a varied number of top journals, including in political science, development and economics. He's now researching a subject very close to our heart here at CGD, which is how individuals support public goods. Varun, welcome to Development Drums.
Thanks so much, Owen. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I propose to organise this discussion in three parts. In the first part, I'm going to ask you to lay out for the audience some of the key insights from behavioural economics and behavioural science, and perhaps explore with you how these ideas differ from conventional economics. Then in the second part, we're going to look at what this means for development policy in particular. So what do we know about whether these cognitive issues and behavioural issues affect the poor? Do they affect the poor in particular? And if they do, what, if anything, can or should people do about that? And then in the third and final section, we'll talk about the implications of all this for the work of development professionals and organisations like the World Bank and aid agencies. To what extent do these biases and mistakes affect development professionals and the way they do their work? Is libertarian paternalism, as the phrase goes, an appropriate stance for aid agencies? And we'll look at the big picture of whether this is an important new insight for development policy or whether it's a quirky sideshow in the bigger picture. So let's start with behavioural economics. Can you tell us a little bit about why this report is called Mind, Society and Behaviour? What is it all about?
So the main message of the report, Owen, is the idea that development policy is due for a redesign based on a more realistic understanding of how human beings think, decide, and behave. And it's useful sometimes to begin with a metaphor. Mm-hmm. Let's think about the airplane cockpit. Mm-hmm. You and I are of a certain age and might recall walking into a cockpit many years ago in which it was basically a wall of instruments. Mm-hmm. For technological reasons, there was a separate dial for different bits of information: altitude, wind speed, longitude, temperature, this kind of thing. This was very cognitively demanding for pilots.
So they had to monitor all these different instruments simultaneously.
They had to visually scan everything. They had to remember what it said a few minutes ago and then integrate it when it came time to make a decision, like choosing an angle of approach, when it came time to land. And this was related to pilot error. So the cockpit was redesigned in more recent years, partly as a result of technological innovations, which allowed this information to be integrated. And so now one panel will show multiple bits of information. Flight path has altitude plus speed and location all in one thing, in one bit of information. It's easier for pilots to make decisions. A pilot error goes down. So that's the basic idea. That is that, directly speaking to your question, whereas we traditionally think of economics as the science of scarcity, scarce land, scarce human capital, scarce money, even scarce information, economics hasn't to this point integrated the idea that cognition itself is a scarce resource.
Right.
It's demanding to actually think. And this is not a metaphor. In fact, when you think hard, your pupils dilate, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure goes up. The same is true when you try and exert willpower. There's one pool of energy that's available for emotional, cognitive, and physical activity, and we deplete it. And as a result of this, we need to be thinking about how to shape the choice environment to allow people to make good decisions that are in their own interest without overly depleting themselves.
So this has become quite a well-known idea in the last, since Daniel Kahneman's book in 2011, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. The idea that some of the decisions we make are automatic decisions and some of them we ponder and consider, and that when we make these automatic and fast decisions, we often make mistakes.
Exactly.
And is that the key insight in behavioural economics and behavioural science? And tell us more about that insight. Tell us what that means.
Yeah. No, it's a crucial idea. It's called dual systems theory. This idea that there are sort of two systems in the mind, and this is sort of metaphoric, but the idea is that you have a system one, to use the lingo that I know Kahneman uses, drawing from others, which is very intuitive and fast. We sort of can decide whether the boss is angry at us very quickly, or we can compare whether object A is longer than object B very quickly. We do this involuntarily. We use the system involuntarily, and sometimes we can't help but to use it. Understanding short sentences in our own language, we sort of can't help it. It doesn't use up energy. System two, which is 17 times 24. It's sort of long calculation. It's comparing proportions as opposed to quantities. This is demanding, and this uses up energy. So as a result, we try to avoid using the system two and rely on system one. And that's pretty good for many of our decisions. The system one sort of helps us assemble coherence in our world. It helps us with certain basic cause and effect questions. But it doesn't, but it also can go astray. It goes astray in systematic, predictable ways. This is really the, if one were to ask why this report now, it's that now, over the past 20, 30 years, we have a body of research that allows us to show that people are not only irrational, but predictably irrational, to borrow a book title from Dan Ariely, so that we know that certain phenomena like anchoring and framing, a loss aversion are going to be, most people exhibit these, and as a result, we should design policies to keep that in mind.
So in conventional economics, the kind that I was brought up with, we were taught that people make mistakes a lot, but that we could assume, this is Friedman's key point in I guess the 1950s, that we could assume that people on average behave as if they're not making these mistakes, because if, for example, an investor is systematically making mistakes, they'll lose their money. If a firm is systematically making mistakes, is failing to serve its customers, they'll be driven out of business by a competitor that doesn't make those mistakes. So the conventional economics view is, yes, of course, people get things wrong, but we can assume that on aggregate, they're going to converge on getting things right. One example of that, I suppose, in the thinking fast and thinking slow framework is that you develop heuristics that work for you. So yes, you're thinking fast with rules of thumb and with habits, but if those habits weren't in the long run delivering what you really wanted and what your underlying objectives were, then you would change the heuristics, you'd change the rule of thumb. So, so why isn't that conventional view? Why doesn't that still mean that although people are making mistakes, they're not making systematic mistakes?
So two thoughts. There are a lot of non-market transactions, right? So if a businessman, businesswoman goes out of business for using incorrect heuristics, that may be fine, and if we've got enough social safety nets and this and that. But for a poor person, going out of business is not a happy story, right? Not going to school when you should is not a happy story. Marrying the wrong person, not getting health care when you need it. Going out of business is a threat to life and livelihood. So the existence of these one-shot non-market interactions where there is no opportunity or limited opportunity to learn and limited arbitrage opportunities are scenarios in which we really need to pay attention to this, right? And the other thing is that these, in fact, do survive in large markets. They're interesting. There are a variety of number of studies on this now. But if you look at the used car market in the U.S., the price of a car that is 80,000, whose odometer reading is 80,100 miles, is systematically higher and much higher than a car that's 79,900 miles. People have left digit bias, and despite the fact that there is an arbitrage opportunity here, the cars are still priced at $100 or $200 higher for not an obvious reason. And so these do survive in markets because people are all affected in consistent ways, so that if I'm affected by a certain set of biases, you, in fact, are also subject to the same biases. You might not take advantage of the arbitrage opportunity that's there.
So what's a good example of this thinking automatically versus thinking slowly issue that affects people in poor countries? And then we'll move on to the other aspects of this, like thinking socially. But let's give an example of thinking automatically.
So one of the challenges that we often face is that governments provide programs, conditional cash transfers, health, education programs. Sometimes people don't take them up, particularly in poor environments. Why not? The payoff might be quite large, but they simply don't necessarily do it. And it's partly because it takes effort, it takes time, even though in the long run it may make sense to take advantage of this. In the short run, people don't necessarily. So there was a study in Tangier in Morocco in which the government was providing a credit subsidy for a water hookup, right? A water hookup's a big problem there, and people spend, I think, 7 to 9 hours a week collecting water, often women, but people weren't signing up. Why is that? Well, there's the hassle factor. You've got to sign up for the darn program. And so when some researchers came in and went to the homes of people and actually photographed the necessary documentation and brought it to the municipality, the sign-up rate went up to 69% from a baseline of 10%. So the implication there is that there's a large agenda related to simplification.
Right, but that's not necessarily an irrational judgment on their part. If people believe that it's going to be time-consuming and expensive for them to queue up and sign up, and if they think there's some risk that even having signed up they're not going to get the service that they're expecting, then they could easily be making a rational cost-benefit calculation that it's just not worth their while to do this thing. Who are you to say that they've made an irrational decision there?
Well, the fact that when you help them, they actually do follow through on it suggests that many of them, in fact, would prefer the water hookup, if it weren't so demanding on time and cognitive resources. So it is, it may be rational in the sense that they don't want to expend the cognitive resources to sign up for this, but it's not rational in the sense that the cognitive resources are not are renewable, and they don't quite. That's just where we sometimes miss that.
But they're temporarily finite, right? I mean, there's a flow of cognitive resources.
That's
So,
right.
am I okay to say, well, this is conventional economics, but with the addition of this important insight that cognitive resources are scarce, and so people are making decisions about how to deploy those cognitive resources, and so that's a rational decision not to exert cognitive resources on a particular problem. Is that is that okay, or is there some other insight that tells us that the conventional economic way of thinking about this isn't right?
That's in the report we talk about the principle that people think automatically, the principle that people think socially, and the principle people think with mental models. We're talking about the first idea now, and I think that's more or less right. I mean, I think it's important to point out that it applies not just to cognitive overload and information, but to willpower.
Right.
And that people often have a hard time following through on their own commitments. We might want to save more, or lose weight, or stop smoking, and we just can't follow through because we overvalue the present if we're going to model the situation, or because the willpower exertion is too large. So I'm not so sure whether it's worthwhile getting into a debate about whether this is a rational choice or not on the part of individuals to overvalue the present or to not exert cognitive energy. The fact is that in the development business, we want to reduce poverty, and that we can take steps to help people achieve what is their own ends. Whether it's rational or not, whether it can be incorporated into an economic model, that's sort of inside, as they say in the US, inside baseball. But the larger point is that people do behave this way, whether or not it's rational.
So let's move on to the second insight about thinking socially. What's that about? And give us an example.
So just to return to the cockpit metaphor again, there's research that suggests that social hierarchy in the cockpit is also related to pilot error. And this is because in the relationship between captains and first officers, you want information to flow. If a plane's going down and the first officer shouldn't be reluctant to say, please lower the wheels now, we're coming close to landing. They should be able to just talk. And if there's a social hierarchy, they won't necessarily speak up. So that social relationship is related to pilot error. In 2013, the American Heart Association came out with a study that found that social hierarchy in the operating room is related to cardiac, among cardiac surgeons, is related to surgical error. And so in those high stakes situations, we know that this is important. The point we want to make is that poverty is also a high stakes situation. We don't often think of this because of the cognitive error of salience. We don't think of poverty deaths as being all that salient, but an airplane disaster, that really gets our attention. But your listeners know that poverty is high stakes. 7.6 million avoidable deaths among kids every year. So if we think about thinking socially, right, the comparison with standard economics is that in standard economics, the idea is that people think by themselves and for themselves, right? They sort of don't, information comes to them.
Optimizing their own well-being.
Right, their own well-being, with basically using their own knowledge, right? In fact, social preferences are quite large. The standard assumption is that everyone's a free rider, right? Given the opportunity, you want to stick it to someone else. There are now behavioral economics experimental games that show the percent of free riders is between 5 and 40%, at most, usually much less than 40%. Most people are conditional cooperators. That is, they're willing to contribute to public goods if the other person is too. They don't want to be suckers, but if the other person is likely to, they will too, right? So most of us are not the jerks, that standard economics may assume. And this seems to be hardwired. There's a fun little experiment that's described in the report in which at a tea bar or a coffee bar, employees were asked to contribute a little bit of money whenever they took the tea, on an honor system. And each week the experimenters varied the picture right in front of the tea. So it was one week it was a picture of flowers, then eyes, and flowers, and eyes, and flowers, and eyes. And every week their contributions were higher when it was eyes than when it was flowers, because people felt like they were being observed. And so we are social animals, and we are very responsive to this idea that others are around us and others are acting,
But interestingly, that suggests that people are not contributing because they're hardwired to contribute to the social good, but because they fear being observed. That suggests the opposite, doesn't it?
It depends how you interpret what happens when you're observed. Is it fear, or is it like, I want to be with this person? There's a variety. But
if people don't feel they're being observed and then just take the coffee anyway without contributing,
people still
suggests
contribute.
That people are instinctively free riders if they think they can get away with it.
It's not the case that contributions were zero when they were flowers.
Right.
There still were contributions. It's just that they were higher when they were eyes.
Right.
And
there is a rationale, isn't there, for this kind of behavior, which is in repeated games, and I think we're in repeated interactions with our fellow human beings. Societies work well if people are rewarded for cooperating and mildly punished when they don't. There's some retribution if people free ride or don't cooperate. And we all do better in a society if that kind of discipline is enforced. And you see this with these ultimatum games in behavioral science, that people do tend to want to resist people who don't cooperate, and they do that presumably because it's in the long run best interest of their community to continue that kind of social pressure.
That may be, but in these ultimatum games, even when they're one-shot games, people do not offer.
Do you want to explain the ultimatum game? Sorry, I introduced it and then failed to explain it. Explain an ultimatum game.
Yeah. So there are games that in behavioral economics in which people try and measure social preferences. Let me start with the dictator game. The dictator game, I give you, Owen, $10, £10, and I say, give Varun some money. And you decide whatever you want to give. And the finding there is that people typically, do give something. The standard assumption is that people would give zero, but that's not what we observe. Right. In the ultimatum game, you give me some money. I'm told that you had 10 and you gave me some, and I have a choice of either accepting your offer. Let's say you gave me 3 and I keep 3 and you keep 7, or saying, forget it, none of us gets anything. And if typically, on average, if you offer me less than, say, 3 or 4, I'm going to say, forget it. I don't want anything.
Right. Even though you're better off with 3 or 4, or 2, say, than with 0.
That's right.
You want to punish me for failing to share properly with you.
That's right. And I will do that in a one-shot game,
Right.
right? Even if I'm never going to see you again, even if I don't really know who you are, if you're anonymous behind some computer screen somewhere.
I still feel that it's wrong. You still feel that it's wrong
That's right.
to only get 2 of the 10.
Exactly. That's right. And that's what we observe. And so there seems to be something about fairness, independent of repeated games, that we care about. That is an important part of the social relationships. And then then we also make the point. Okay, so now we know that we are social beings, and so what does this mean, right? It means we have social preferences, and we can use, for lack of a better word, social incentives to motivate people. Recognition, status, that matters a lot, and this can motivate doctors, healthcare providers, all of us. We also care about social norms. And this is a social norm, although it's sometimes used kind of loosely, basically consists of 2 parts. One is the idea that you ought to be doing something. The other is that many people, in fact, do it. And we can leverage this idea to change behavior. An important area, say, sanitation behavior. If we want to change that, we can leverage the idea that maybe this is something we ought to do, and that more and more people are doing it. And there are other examples in the report. And then there's the idea of social networks, which is the idea that I might pay more attention to information if it comes from my friend or my neighbor, to people I regularly interact with, than from the government.
Right.
And that's an important. That gives rise to an important set of policy levers as well.
So this, again, I'm sorry to harp on about this, still feels like it's completely consistent with conventional economics. We're just saying that people have preferences that include being social animals, that people are not in fact purely, their preferences are not purely selfish to maximize their own income or food consumption, or their well-being includes the well-being of others. And that's obvious. People very obviously care about their family, for example, but they also care about people around them, and there are all kinds of reasons for that. But even if they weren't, I don't think anybody in economics has ever said that human preferences don't include the welfare of other people in their own preferences. So this is just a restatement of that important principle, isn't it? It's not that this isn't a departure from what we all knew in Microeconomics 101, is it?
Well, I mean, I think there, if you look at utility functions, if you looked at a lot of them, I would hazard to say that most of them are about individual utility,
right,
and not group utility. Maybe family, people are willing to allow. But the idea that there is altruism is not commonly modeled. Even though it's sort of allowable in the field, it's not commonly modeled.
Okay.
And in addition, I'd say that there's something about social norms, which is, I think, relatively new and perhaps inconsistent, which is that people, we sometimes in economics will talk about norms as a constraint, right? Sort of, I will maximize this subject to a set of constraints, a budget constraint, and then some sort of a choice set that's finite. But norms can be internalized, so that they really sort of change what I want to do.
Right.
And they may be internalized in a way that's not necessarily about making Owen happy. It's not my preferences may not be altruistic in the sense. They may be just, I want to conform.
Right.
I want to do what other people are doing. And in economics, we often think about this as a coordination problem, because my payoffs are higher. That may or may not, that may be true, often it is, but there may be situations where I just want to conform because that's what social beings do. So I think that's relatively new.
And then let's move to the third part of the story, which is thinking with mental models.
Yeah.
What's that about, and what's an example of that?
So thinking with mental models is basically the idea that information needs to be interpreted. When information comes to someone about, let's say, the behavior of a different ethnic group or different religious group, I'm likely to filter out information in systematic ways related to my views of the world. We have mental models for health, mental models of other people, mental models of ourselves. A nice example, which is in the report in the chapter on climate change, is the idea, is the historical fact that when settlers came to Jamestown, Virginia, they thought they could grow pomegranates, olives, figs, tangerines that are that can be grown in southern Spain or Italy, on the idea that temperature and climate is constant at any latitude. It turns out not to be the case, but settlers persisted for 13 years, similarly in trying to grow these products, these crops. Similarly, people went to Newfoundland and thought it would be relatively warm, but it wasn't. And they persisted, they kept on thinking, oh, this is an anomalously cold year. It's an anomalously cold year. And they didn't really update their views. It took a long time because they had a view of how temperature is related to latitude and climate is related to latitude. There's a nice example also in the same chapter about how this really complicates our understanding on climate change. Why do our views change so slowly? There's a nice paper which makes the reasonable assumption that to really think that the climate has systematically changed, if you think that requires, say, 3 straight years where the average high is 1 standard deviation above the historical high, if you calibrate that on historical data, it will take 86 years to sort of update your views. And so we sort of have this idea and we fixate on it. In the case of climate change, it's not only about a sort of a scientific view, but it becomes a tribal allegiance. It becomes a marker of belonging. I get my views from people I hang out with. They affect how I think about this model.
But that's also how scientific views get updated, right? It's also tribal allegiance. I mean, wasn't that the great idea of the paradigm shift? That people had a model and they persisted with it. Until you had an awful lot of evidence that there was something wrong with the model, and then the model undergoes a paradigm shift and the tribe moves to some other model, and that persists until enough evidence accumulates that it needs to be updated. So it's not science is guilty of the same. I mean, scientists are not all updating their Bayesian priors every minute. They're also undergoing these periods of stability and change, aren't they? I mean,
fair enough, right? This is Thomas Kuhn's story, right. And I think the key difference may be that scientists seem anyway to be using a fair amount of system 2, sort of analytic deliberative thinking and arguing about this, and developing standards for what constitutes enough evidence for a change in a fundamental view. Whereas the rest of us are reading the newspapers, we're sort of talking to our neighbors. The process by which we update our views is much more system 1 oriented, quick thinking heuristics. And also the politics is a different kind of politics.
So does that make it more or less likely that we'd be fluid about it? If it's, for example, there's a story that with social media and 24/7 news that people update their view of the world very quickly now. And if people are thinking with System 1, they're interacting, they're much more networked than they used to be. Does that suggest that our collective tribal view is now more fluid and more moves around more quickly than it used to?
Yeah, I think probably not, and that's precisely the heart of this, the thrust of this point about mental models.
Right.
I mean, even though the information, the external environment's changing, what is more the durable dispositions? Bourdieu writes about this kind of thing. Sort of the internalized mental models don't take it in. Even if there's some new view that's constantly changing, you have to interpret the information, and those are relatively stable among people over long periods of time. Not that behavior doesn't change, but the mental models are not easy to change.
And yet, again, in conventional economics, our assumption has always been that people realize when their models are not delivering for them the results they want to deliver, even if they don't know exactly why, and that they will, people won't be away from their optimum for long, that they will collectively shift. You're saying actually that it takes a lot longer than that. That you can be away from what we don't update our models very quickly. But that feels like an opportunity for arbitrage, or it feels like there's something that needs to be explained there. Why haven't we learned, if it's costly to us not to update our mental models quickly, Why haven't we learned to update them more quickly? Or what could we do to learn to update them more quickly?
Yeah. So I guess two thoughts. One, it's very costly to update them, along the lines we discussed, earlier. Two, it's often in someone's interest that we not update them.
Right.
There are some studies, Darwin Acemoglu, James Robinson, others have looked at, villages in India in which villagers who are not doing well, tend to be very favorably disposed to the dominant landlords, even though they're personally not doing well. And so the story there is that there's legitimacy follows power, and it's in the interest of certain actors to sort of maintain a mental model.
Right.
And when there's a variety of techniques, hegemony, all these kinds of things, in which this is done. So that's one thing. And the third point is that it's just hard to shake these habits of mind. We have stereotypes about different races, about other genders, about different religious groups that are really hard to shake. And they sort of captivate the mind. And there's evidence that it sort of starts very early on. So I think that the standard economic story needs some refinement here.
You're listening to Development Drums with me, Owen Barder, and my guest today is the co-director of this year's World Development Report, Varun Gauri. If you enjoy this podcast, you might also like to listen to the CGD podcast hosted by my colleague Rajesh Merchandani, which you can find in iTunes or on the CGD website or wherever you find good podcasts. In the next section, we're going to explore the relevance of all this to development economics. And then in the final section, we'll look at the implications for development professionals and development organizations. Varun, the World Development Report, congratulations on what people say is the most widely read WDR in years.
Thanks.
So congratulations on doing that. This is an important flagship publication for the World Bank. It reflects thinking that's going on in the economics profession and development economics, but it also shapes it. So this is it's important that there is a report on this topic this year. Why did you want to do something on behavioral science and behavioral economics for development specifically? What's the connection between the things we've talked about and poverty and poor people and the World Bank's mission of eliminating absolute poverty?
Yeah. Two thoughts on this. One is that there is really, I think one of the reasons people have been interested in this report is that we're sort of riding the crest of a wave. There's been a lot of interest in this topic for several years. There are behavioral economics units in a number of governments now. Richard Thaler has been president of the American Economic Association. So behavioral economics is really mainstream now. It's not some out there marginal, subdiscipline. And so there's general understanding that this can be useful for policymaking, right? And development policy is policymaking, and so we should bring this into development economics in the way that's been brought into, the other parts of the discipline. The second thought is that there may be, we've been talking about cognitive resources being scarce. This may be even a more important constraint for poor individuals.
In what sense?
Well, there are a lot of decisions that you and I make that are easy, right? If we want to save money, we can have a standard transfer from our checking account to our savings account or to a brokerage account. I have 3 kids, but I haven't thought about college education for a little while because I have I have an automatic transfer that sort of thinks about this for me. Poor individuals don't have this, modern financial products often. There are also a number of challenges related to just getting by. Organized childcare, is not available. Basic things, if you're in the informal sector, where to sell your wares, worrying about someone that might come harass you, getting home, transportation. And these deplete cognitive resources, this cognitive and willpower resources. There's a terrifically engaging book by Senda Mullainathan and Elder Shafir, which looks at the problem of scarcity. One of the one of the studies they cite in that paper, in that book, is one of their own, which looked at sugarcane farmers in India. They found that in this sample of sugarcane farmers, there was a real difference in behavior and cognitive process pre and post-harvest. Post-harvest is when there's cash, pre-harvest is when there's not. Pre-harvest, more than 90% of them had taken out loans. Post-harvest, I believe it was 4%, or relatively small. Similarly, they were much more likely to have pawned goods pre-harvest than post-harvest. Now, the interesting thing is that this has an impact on cognitive functioning as well. The same sugarcane farmer had a lower IQ test score during a resource scarce time pre-harvest than post-harvest. 10 points, actually, the same farmer. 10 points is a lot. If I were to keep you up all night and ask you to take a test, your IQ would drop about 12 or 13 points. So that's almost as much as a full night's sleep. And this is the result of all these demands, which are depleting cognitive resources. So for poor individuals, whom the World Bank and other development agencies are trying to help, realizing that cognitive constraints are a problem is really important.